So we've been over stuff like this before, but this comes from the Atlantic, and it's once again publishing the myths of Brexit. So this is from the Atlantic. This is Britain's contradictory Brexit myths. So, for more than 3 years, the world has watched Britain attempt to act on the result of its 26 referendum and leave the European Union. Yet, while the causes of the Brexit vote were complex, the causes of the catastrophic handling of the Brexit protest might be familiar to anyone versed in imperial or post-imperial history. They stem from a belief in British exceptionalism, the idea that Britain is inherently different from and superior to other nations and empires. Margaret Thatcher asserted British exceptionalism with regard to the EU in a 1988 speech, and each of the past three prime ministers has approached the EU from that standpoint, believing that Britain deserves preferential treatment and more than equal status. They have also believed in their own personal exceptionalism. David Cameron believed he could win the referendum and thereby head off the electoral threat to his party from the right. He did not. Theresa May believed she could turn a narrow 52-48 vote in favour of leaving into a mandate for a hard Brexit, which Britain got everything it wanted and gave up nothing. She did not. Now Boris Johnson is voluntarily manufacturing a crisis over no deal, in which Britain would leave the EU without any agreement on the rules and regulations governing how it would trade and work with the bloc. That would send damaging shockwaves throughout Britain, Ireland and the rest of the EU. There has been much discussion of the roles of history and memory in relation to Brexit. It may not be easy to overstate a simplistic literalist connection between the empire imagined as a glorious, unjustly lost, and the impulse to leave the EU. Yet, it is hard to avoid the sense that that embedded in Brexit is a form of "Make Britain Great Again," which again we've discussed before. Sharper parallels are drawn between Britain's collective recollection of its part in World War II, the heavily mythologized as a moment it stood alone against Adolf Hitler, and the attitude of the Brexit supporters to the isolation and hardship Brexit may bring. While the myths constructed around the history of the Empire and World War II reinforce British exceptionalism, they are contradictory. The first cast Britain as a superpower, the second as a lone plucky underdog. This dissonance is not new, nor is it unique to the Brexit process. It has helped produce disasters on an international scale before. The Suez Crisis, during which Britain was neither able to take control of the Suez Canal nor able to oust Egypt's anti-imperialist leader Gamal Nasser. It is also often cited as a precursor to Brexit. Oh yeah, it's also cited as a precursor. So there we go. Brexit is a withdrawal from a voluntary union. Suez is a covert invasion of a sovereign state. They are wholly different. Yet there is a familiarity to the grand aspirations undercut by slapdash and delusional strategic planning. To be frank, rush to act even as it becomes clear that most of all the options are damaging to the leaders fixed on a path that many can see will probably end badly. In general, Britain remembers Suez as a blip in what is widely viewed as the most well-intentioned and complicit imperial policy. There we go. Sorry, where were we? Policy. Far from ending British exceptionalism, the disaster has been used to reinforce it. Suez has been framed as a unique aberration. If it is blamed on what was erroneously held to have been a betrayal by the United States and on the folly of one man, the physicality and mentally exhausted Prime Minister Anthony Eden, that heads off the more troubling questions about whether there were deeper problems with the cabinet decision-making and military advice, foreign policy, and the political culture as a whole. and even the nation's understanding of itself. The historian A. Kim Wagner has made a similar argument about the Armistice Massacre of 1919, where Winston Churchill denounced that event in which imperial forces fired on Indian civilians in an enclosed space, killing hundreds, as without precedent or parallel in the modern history of the British Empire, and absolutely foreign to the British way of doing things. Churchill, who was a strong believer in empire, had not suddenly become a critic. As Wagner points out in his book, An Empire of Fear and the Making of a Massacre, Churchill's speech was, on the contrary, an elaborate act of deflection and a staunch attempt to reassert the moral legitimacy of the British Empire. Just months later, Churchill was part of the cabinet that deployed the Black and Tans, temporary constables who gained the reputation for violence against civilians in Ireland. Exceptionalism is again visible in what was by the most metrics a far bigger disaster than Suez or Amritsar, the partition of India and Pakistan, which left between 1 to 2 million people dead and created 10 million to 20 million refugees, and established a hostile relationship between the successor states that threatens global security to this day. The last British Viceroy of India, Lord Mountbatten, has been blamed ever since for speeding up Britain's exit deadline up. What he achieved by that was to ensure that most of the fallout didn't happen on Britain's watch. Internationally, many newspapers reported Indian and Pakistan independence alongside photographs of Mountbatten and the British officials applauding the raising of the new flags. So only in the days and weeks after the partition did the shocking reports of the death and destruction ramp up, and so British exceptionalism was able to remain unscathed. Unscarred. Sorry. The British could sigh sadly at the appalling outcome and murmur, "Après nons deluge." The writer Mustarit had described as a marginal as malign incompetence, common to Mountbatten and the Brexiteers. His point rings true, but the critique cannot be limited to a few individuals, or it risks again letting the system off by the hook. Why do British politics, society and culture produce such individuals that promote them and reward them? Why only so many similar results of a system can only be dismissed as aberrations before it begins to seem as if they might not be aberrations at all? A British leadership that wanted to deliver Brexit safely and was not enthralled to exceptionalism might have learned from the past mistakes. Suez might have taught it to prefer reality over fantasy, compromise and coalition over arrogance and vaingloriousness. Petition might have taught it to respect and understand the complexity rather than oversimplify difficult problems, to make a plan before setting tight deadlines. Both might have taught you that you should never ever imagine what you've had enough of, that you've never had enough of experts. But to learn from your mistakes, you must confront them. And exceptionalism means that you never do. Success may be evident of Britain's greatness, but failures are inherently un-British. It is worth noting too that the exceptionalism does not affect only those who support Brexit. As the historian Robert Sanders has pointed out, the idea that Britain should leave the EU, the widely deployed by campaigners who supported staying in the EU in 2016, as as strong as an imperial heritage as the aspirations to leave it. What would be exceptional about meekly accepting the status with 27 others? So one of the things that I definitely want to point out here is that we've seen this time and time again, and we're seeing it now with what Boris Johnson has been doing this week. He is absolutely certain that somehow all these 27 other countries are going to roll over and give the UK what they want. But even the EU has said, if you leave with a no deal, all we are going to do when you come back to us, and we will be going back to them, is they will just go, here's that withdrawal agreement, to which we will have to sign it at that point. There will be no negotiations. We will have to sign it, and and Boris Johnson and his party will be in a position where they will be forced to sign it. They will have no other option. So Brexit is exposing the flaws in the British political system and culture, but they are not new. Exceptionalist thinking has long helped insulate the system from criticism and the reform it needs. For advocates and critics of Brexit alike, it may be tempting to imagine a golden age in which Britain was competent, reliable, stable, and sensible. Looking at history, though, if it turns out to be none of these things, we shouldn't be surprised. And that is the deadly thing that we are really looking at in this case. We are in a system that rewards people who are abject failures and are not fit to be in the position that they are in. And yet they are, again, rewarded, seen as, oh, it's fine, it's just Boris. No one in their right mind would ever hire Boris Johnson. Jacob Rees-Mogg, no one would ever hire Jacob Rees-Mogg in their right mind. Bear in mind, the only job Jacob Rees-Mogg had was managing his monetary firm, which he was the head of for a while. And from the first quarter after he took over, it stopped making money until he left. And then the following quarter, after he left and the new guy had taken over, it started making money again. But unfortunately, that's the British system, and it is inherently flawed, and it is something we need to take care of as being British people ourselves. We need to do this. We need to drastically rehaul our system. And one of the things I've talked bang on continuously about on this channel before is that people really need to be active when going to select their MPs. And the way you do that is you have to be a member of your party. You have to get involved with your local Labour organisation, Lib Dem, Conservative, whatever. You have to be involved. You have to be involved and select them. Otherwise, you end up with a situation like this. You end up with people who have no idea what they're doing in a position where they can wreak unimaginable bad consequences. And we have a government, we've had 2 or 3 governments which have been so short-sighted and can't even contemplate long-term planning. But there you go. Whatever happens, who knows what the hell's going to happen? As I've said, Brexit, who knows literally what's going to happen? We could end with a hard Brexit, we could end with a soft Brexit, we could just end up remaining. That is all those 3 options are still viable options. And one thing we need to do, if Brexit has shown anything, we need to reform our political system. And I tell you now, we cannot reform the political system with the absolute right-wing party, the Conservatives, in charge. They cannot be trusted to draft up a constitution or anything like that, because they will simply make it so that they always have the advantage and that they always win. We cannot allow that to happen. And we have to have checks and balances, because Britain has flirted with republicanism close at the end of the Civil War for 6 years. I highly recommend going. I think, what's the book called now? I think it's called The British Republic, something like that, and it chronicles what happened during the 6 years where Parliament took over as a republic, up until Oliver Cromwell came in and took over. It's a very good book, definitely well worth a read. But if anything, it proves we need checks and balances. We need a actual, like a Supreme Court or something else that keeps, Parliament in check. We need a proper Another chamber. We need to get rid of the Lords and replace it with something else that's more fitting. Our system needs drastically updating. But like I say, this is something that you cannot trust the Tories to do at all. I wouldn't trust Boris Johnson to do this at all.